السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. نيابة عن المركز الوطني للتعليم الإلكتروني، نرحب بكل من انضم معنا في جلسة تجربة المنظمات الحكومية الدولية وسياساتها. وأسعد أنا محدثتكم الدكتورة هاجر بن عصفور بإدارة هذه الجلسة، والتي تأتي ضمن برنامج المؤتمر الدولي التعليم الإلكتروني لتنمية القدرات البشرية، والذي ينظمه المركز الوطني للتعليم الإلكتروني خلال الفترة بين 24 وحتى 27 من الشهر الجاري. ونود التنبيه بأن الترجمة الفورية متوفرة باللغة العربية لهذه الجلسة، وبإمكانكم الضغط على أيقونة الترجمة في أسفل الشاشة إن رغبتم بتفعيلها. وإذا كانت لديكم أسئلة موجهة للمتحدثين فيمكنكم وضعها في خانة الدردشة باللغة العربية أو باللغة الإنجليزية، وسيتم الرد على أسئلتكم في نهاية الورشة بإذن الله. Good afternoon. On behalf of the National E-Learning Center and the International Conference on E-Learning for Human Capability Development, we welcome you all to this session where we will be discussing intergovernmental experience and policy perspective. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Dr. Hajar bin Asfour, the moderator of this session. It is a great opportunity today to bring together two experts and lifelong learning specialists who will be discussing the role of skilling and reskilling in a challenging context, skills and employability, and lifelong learning systems from both policy and practice perspectives. We welcome Dr. Burhan Chakron, the Director of Policies and Lifelong Learning Systems Division in the Education Sector in UNESCO. Dr. Chakron is an engineer and has a PhD in Education Sciences. He worked as trainer, chief trainer, project manager, and a short-term consultant for many international organizations. He also worked as Senior Human Capital Development Specialist at the European Training Foundation. Dr. Chakron's recent work focuses on global trends in reforming education and training systems and global agenda for skills development in the context of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. We also welcome Dr. Pedro Moreno de Fonseca, a lifelong learning specialist at the International Labour Organization. Dr. Fonseca worked at the European Union Agency for Vocational Education and Training, where he developed research and coordinated an expert network. He has also acted as policy advisor for employment policies and lectured on educational administration. So before we start this session, please allow me to present few guidelines for the participants. Interpretation is available in Arabic for this session, and you can activate the interpretation icon in your Zoom page. At the end of this session, there will be 10 minutes for questions and answers. If you have any questions, you may post them in the chat, either in English or Arabic. Now, I would like to invite Dr. Chakron to start his presentation. Please, Doctor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I would like first to congratulate the Center for this very important event and very timely discussion, which I think will inform the debate, of course, in Saudi Arabia, but beyond, it will inform also the discussion internationally. And I'm very honored and pleased today to share with you some of the perspective of the work we have been doing. Let me start by sharing a bit the work we are doing in this area and what we have been doing in the area of technical and vocational education and training in at UNESCO. Sorry, just give me 1 second to get the slide. I don't know if you can see my slide. Okay, I hope you can see it now.
Yes, doctor, it's clear.
Okay, thank you very much. So I put the title of my presentation, Equitable and Quality Lifelong Learning Opportunities for All, because I think it's very important that we take this inclusive and link with the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the Sustainable Development Goal 4. I'm sure that my colleague from ILO will also speak about SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth. So, but let me focus on the lifelong learning opportunities for all, and this is part of the Sustainable Development Goal 4 goals. Maybe I think it's very important to contextualize the discussion today, and it's very important to acknowledge, or at least to take some lessons from the global education and training landscape. And I'm sharing with you the data as of today on the disruption of the education and training systems. We still have around 50 million learners who are affected by the COVID disruption. Of course, the situation has been improving, but still the learning losses are real and they are unequal. And it's very important that we take into consideration that this will affect the future of learning, but will affect also the access to labor market, skills and upskilling of the individuals and the generation that will be affected by the COVID crisis. But there is also an important aspect of impact on the global labor markets. And if we look at the data coming from ILO colleagues, we see that the unemployment rate is still very high. It didn't go down to the pre-COVID situation, with an important impact on particularly on youth in terms of their transition to the labor market, but also for low-skilled workers and other workers who are affected by both the COVID crisis, but also by the digitalization of the economy, the transitions in some of the economies. The situation is diverse, and while it is improving in OECD countries, and in some cases we are almost back to a situation of 2019, like in Japan, in the United States. But when we look at the situation in Arab region, we see that the unemployment rate is very high, is still high, and it doesn't go down to the situation pre-COVID. So when we are speaking about skills development, when we're speaking about lifelong learning opportunities, we have to take into account that the economies are disrupted, and obviously the labor market is disrupted, and that has implications on the way we will be developing a skills development program will be cater for the most disadvantages in the labor market. And there is a paradox, is that in some economies, in particular in US and OECD countries, there is a rather high demand for labor and less supply of labor in some of the sectors. And this is something that is looked at very closely, in particular in US, in UK, in European countries as well. Some sectors are hardly filling jobs. Just to refer to, for example, in France, we have around 100,000 jobs in restaurants who are not filled. In some of the sectors, there is a acute demand for skills and they are not filled. So the question is, of course, how we will be responding to those demands as well. But of course, this is a situation not in everywhere. We know that there are some economies where there is still very high unemployment rate, where there is still a large labor supply, particularly youth supply, and less demand in terms of openings. As we are speaking on e-learning and discussing what are the learning solutions, I wanted just to refer to that when we are speaking about e-learning probably, or when we're speaking about remote learning, it's very important to think about the mix of technology that have been used, in particular during the COVID crisis. When we looked at what countries are doing, we have found that in most cases, including in the most advanced economies, there have been a use of a set of technologies, high-end technologies like online learning, but also low-end and even sometimes no technology with take-home packages. So I think this mix of technology is very important to keep in mind, and that the solution will be about a mix of technologies, giving the connectivity rate, giving some of the challenges that some of the economies and countries are facing. But when we asked member states and countries how they see the remote learning, most of them, and around 73, consider that remote learning is important and is a way to substitute to school days. Around 91% of member states are considering to incorporate into the learning processes this year e-learning dimension or a remote learning dimension. So remote learning, e-learning will be part of the landscape, and is very important to keep that in mind. But still, there is a lot of attention toward the issues of connectivity, the issues of, I would say, disparity in terms of the digital divide. We see it within and across countries, and this is something that I hope in your discussion you have addressed it. But we have to act together in terms of how we will fill the digital divide. What are the strategies that countries have to do and have to apply, and what are the programs that can fill this digital divide within and across countries. And this is something that is very important for an organization like UNESCO, which is about supporting all member states, addressing their needs and achieving the Sustainable Development Goal 4. But let me build further on what are the crisis lessons learned and what are the impacts on education and training. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, we have all evidence about the learning losses, and they are significant. In particular, they are unequal. The most disadvantaged, the population that has less opportunities, is largely affected and is more affected than the most privileged part of the society, and of course across countries. It has impact on lifelong learning opportunities, because most of those disadvantaged group and some of the youth are missing in terms of learning opportunities and will not acquire all the skills that they need to transit to labor market and to engage further in lifelong learning processes. It has impact in terms of future earnings. According to a report that we published with the World Bank and UNICEF, this will have a $17 trillion loss in future earning of current learners. And that has implication in terms of their revenue, their status in the labor market, and of course, in their capacity to have a wealthy life. Something that came into the discussion, and something new, I believe, in terms of the attention that you are giving, is the well-being of learners and teachers. Skills for well-being, attention to well-being of learners, and of course, how the training providers, how policy can cater for those issues. So in terms of policies, policymakers will have to both think about short-term responses and also long-term implications for the work and for the strategies, including e-learning strategies. And we are shaping that or crafting it in terms of the 3 R's: how to recover, how to build resilience, and how to reimagine learning for the future. And these are dimensions that are important for all member states. Of course, some of member states are now affected by the Omicron variant, and some of them will still have to face a challenging situation, sanitary situation. But obviously, all the countries are looking to recover, and they have developed, for example, recovery plans that are focusing on skills, and I will come back to that in a few seconds. So how did we respond? First of all, we have been collecting data and evidence. We have conducted surveys with ILO, the World Bank, and OECD. We have looked at how countries are responding in terms of the skills development strategies. We have engaged in policy dialogue. We have provided resources and advocacy for education and training, but we have also mobilized it for action. And concretely, this means, first of all, we have adopted the declaration that we call the Global Education Meeting Declaration, that sets some priorities on schools reopening, on attention to teachers, But importantly, it's about skills development, particularly for jobs and for new jobs and for people who are at risk of losing their jobs and how they can upskill and reskill. It's about also the digital divide and how we can narrow the digital divide. This is a global commitment of all member states. And these are priority actions that have been adopted in Paris last November at the UNESCO General Conference. But we also acted to protect education finance. We have looked, for example, at the stimulus packages and have looked at how much resources are allocated to education in this context. And I must say that it's a bit disappointing. Out of the full packages to the economic recovery and the stimulus packages, less than 3% is allocated to education and training. Of course, there are a variety of situations across countries, but this is the international average. But when you go to low income and middle income countries, the resources allocated to skills development and education and training in the recovery plans is less than 1%. The good news is that there is 36% out of these resources, out of the 3% allocated to education and training, 36% are allocated to upskilling and reskilling opportunities for workers and for youth accessing the labor market. This is important. There are also attention to remote learning. 53% of the resources are allocated to remote learning. So it's very important that we look at, do we have the resources to invest in this recovery, and are countries allocating the right resources to that? From a UNESCO perspective, we have acted to mobilize partners, and we launched a global education coalition as a platform for cooperation, which now involves around 200 member states, and 200 members, and it includes multilateral partners, private sector, media partners, civil society, and network and associations. The objectives is to ensure the learning continuity and to leverage the potential of those partners to support member states in their response to the COVID and recovery and resilience building and reimagining education, as I mentioned earlier. We are working in more than 100 member states to actively respond to the crisis and to respond to the demands. And one example I wanted to mention is the Global Skills Academy that we launched in last year, and that is aiming at equipping 1 million youth with the skills for employability. And I will come back to that, but just to mention one of them. Maybe all this means some major challenges for lifelong learning opportunities for all. And some of them are related to labor market changes, inequity of access, quality challenges, and the importance of mobilization for action. The labor market changes are important. When we look at, for example, data coming from a work that McKinsey Global Institute has conducted in around 7 countries, we see that in the future there is a demand for high-level type set of skills. The middle level of skills will be rather shrinking, and the low skills will be rather shrinking as well. Of course, the situation is different across countries, but it's very important to think about what are the occupations that will be in demand in the future and how we can prepare for that. We also know that while the digital economy and Industry 4.0 is a mantra for the global discussion, but the situation is different across countries and across sectors. If we look at, for example, the density of robots and robot workers in different economies, we can see that a country like South Korea and Japan are investing in robotization very quickly. But a country like France, Canada, and Switzerland have less investment at this stage. But that sectors like automotive sector, electronics, electrical, metal, and machinery are investing more in robotization than food, for example, sector or plastics. So it's very important that we, while looking at the Industry 4.0 implication, we also think about the variety of the situation and the differences and the way the economies will digitize in the future. We also know that people have difficulty to access to lifelong learning, particularly for adult learning, and particularly for low-skilled adults. Let me just give an example here from data from the EU. In 2016, only 37% of adults participated in lifelong learning opportunities. For the low-qualified persons, it's even less, it's around 18%. So access is rather unequal. And it's very important that we, when we are developing strategies, we think about inclusiveness and access, particularly for low-skilled adults. Some of the arguments that are put forward are about cost of the courses, or loss of income, lack of awareness about training opportunities, uncertainty about the value of the learning opportunities. Some are about time constraints. And the e-learning strategy can address some of them, lowering the cost, potentially managing learning in different moments, connecting different learning spaces, using different devices. And this is a potential that the e-learning strategy can bring into the discussion. And of course, thinking about the lifelong learning dimension of it. But we need to address some of the challenges, and obviously the rising participation in lifelong learning will require supporting people and companies. And it's very important that we think how we can support not only companies, but also people, how we address their needs. And even within companies, the small and medium sizing companies are the ones that have difficulties to invest in adult learning, to invest in lifelong learning opportunities. That we have to think about much more well-coordinated financing, guidance, and validation processes. But we need an approach that is a partnership that can cater for social dialogue that involves employers representative and workers representative. And I'm sure my colleague at ILO will confirm this approach. We have developed, and I mentioned earlier, a global skills academy that is trying to leverage potential of a wide range of partners, from IBM to Huawei to Orange to Dior and other organizations that are offering lifelong learning opportunities, particularly employability opportunities for youth to access to labor market. And part of this work we are doing is to match the demand from youth in different vocational training centers and the supply from those partners who have an offer on employability skills. And we reached now around 250,000 learners. And we are working with other organizations to scale up our work. And it's a call for partners to join us as well, including the center in Saudi Arabia. Some of those partners I mentioned. Let me finish with so where to go from here, and what are the challenges that we have to take forward. First of all, in most discussion and economies, we're thinking about these twin challenges of climate change and building green economies and sustainable economies, and digital transformation and building Industry 4.0 and building the skills for Industry 4.0. Of course, the Sustainable Development Agenda is much broader, but those are two interconnected challenges that we have to face, all of us, and the lifelong learning strategy have to face as well. Maybe just to say that both organization ILO and UNESCO have built a very important prospective work on where the future of work and where the future of learning will go. And they have common denominators. They are human-centered. It's about lifelong learning for all. It's about sustainable economies and societies. When it comes to the futures of education, within UNESCO and as part of the International Commission, we thought about a new social contract for education and training, which covers 5 dimensions: a change and transformation of pedagogies, a transformation of the curricula, a transformation of the teaching and learning processes, rethinking schools, but very important for lifelong learning, learning in all areas of life and connecting different learning spaces. We learn in the workplace, we learn in a workshop, we learn virtually, we learn in life. And it's important how we are able to connect those learning spaces and how we can value the learning happening in those different learning spaces. And we have some tools for that. And we have some strategies that I would like to finish my presentation with. First of all, it's very important that we think about lifelong learning journey, how we connect those learning spaces, how we understand better the learning experience, how we can better assess and recognize the learning. For example, leveraging micro-credentialing, stacking, and interoperability, linking learners with relevant learning opportunities, creating a culture of lifelong learning in societies and in organizations. And it's very important that we take this forward in terms of the policies and strategies. And we have some interesting initiatives. For example, together with ILO colleagues, we looked at entitlements to lifelong learning. And this is about a right-based perspective. And we have seen that some countries have adopted a 4 stages approach: a declaration of a commitment to lifelong learning, a declaration of commitment to specific measures to make the lifelong learning reality, and some of them are about entitlements, implementing those lifelong learning entitlements, and successfully fulfillment of those entitlements. These are the processes that we have seen across some countries like France, Singapore, Korea now, Australia when it comes to low-skilled workers, Portugal as well. So we have seen those stages being implemented. And this is, for example, what a country like Singapore has adopted the Skills Future initiative, which focuses on 4 dimensions, in making individuals well-informed about the choices, having an integrated high-quality system of education and training, promote employers' recognition and career development, and foster a culture that supports a lifelong learning dimension. This is an example of a country that have tried to future the lifelong learning developments and a right to lifelong learning for their citizens. I also mentioned the micro-credentials, and again, we are in a landscape that is evolving. There are still some confusion regarding the definitions, regarding what we call a micro-credential and what does it serve. And at UNESCO, we have conducted the work last year, and we proposed a definition that is a tentative international definition that, first of all, we think that micro-credential is a record of focused learning that verifies what learners know and can do. It includes assessment. It is awarded by a competent body. It has a standalone value, but may contribute to other learning opportunities. And it includes the quality assurance dimension. There is a report that we'll be publishing very soon on the micro-credentialing, and we are working to develop an international quality framework for micro-credentials that we hope can inform the debate and can advance the agenda. But an example is a country like New Zealand, which included micro-credential in their national qualification framework. And they have developed a set of micro-credentials since 2018 in different sectors. And this linkages between micro-credentials and qualification framework is very important. It's an asset for recognizing those micro-credentials, for valuing them, but for putting them in a lifelong learning perspective. And I think it's very important for our discussion today. Let me thank you for your attention, and I hope this can inform our discussion later, and I look forward for our debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brohin. I think it is very unfortunate, but us as an educators, we should see it from the bright side, and we should admit that what happened in the world in different levels is unfortunate, but it raised learners' awareness of the need of e-learning programs, and also the micro-credentials, and also there are some skills that appears now in the surface. People before they didn't think about these skills, like the working remotely and learning remotely. Now people has begun to take courses in these specific or certain skills. Also about the Global Skills Academy, we would like later to hear more about it. We are really excited about this, and we look forward to hear positive results about this Global Academy. Thank you so much, Dr. Brohin. Now I would like to invite our next speaker, Dr. Fonseca. Please, Doctor.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening. It's a great pleasure to represent the International Labour Organization in this important event. I would like to thank the organization for having us here alongside our dear colleagues from UNESCO, my dear colleague Borhen. And I would first of all just ask you to allow me for a few seconds to put my presentation up to. There we go. Yes. So it is quite, I would say, quite challenging to follow up to Borhani. I think he said really a lot of things already, focused on a lot of relevant aspects. And I think that what I have to say will, let's say, speak very closely to many of the aspects that he has already discussed. I would start by saying and fully agreeing that the approach that the ILO and UNESCO have, the work that is done, is entirely complementary, and the way we cooperate and work on relevant issues linked to skill systems and lifelong learning creates better results when we are working in an integrated fashion. So a lot of what I will say will also be connected to that. I think that in this presentation, I will essentially talk about, in general, the approach that the ILO has to lifelong learning. I will speak also a little bit about the contribution of skilling and reskilling in this challenging context, and reflect a bit on the characteristics of a strong skills and lifelong learning system. At the end, we will land in a few conclusions. As my colleague mentioned, of course, the United Nations agencies, particularly UNESCO and the ILO, have their work framed by the Sustainable Development Goals, especially SDG 4 and SDG 8. And the ILO, being a normative organization, has also its activity strongly sustained by a set of texts of official documents endorsed by member states and by social partners. Chief among them is the Human Resources Development Recommendation, which pretty much frames the type of approach that the ILO has to the development of skills and lifelong learning systems. There are other important instruments and discussions which have been recorded. I would highlight very briefly just a centenary declaration of the organization, which in a way confirms the key role, the central role of skills and lifelong learning in promoting access to decent work and a balanced and inclusive economic growth. And I would also highlight the fact that in the last general discussion during the International Labour Conference that was held in November and December of last year, there was a call for the organization to develop a skills and lifelong learning strategy and to reinforce its role in supporting constituents in this area. So let's say together alongside UNESCO, we are also strongly invested in this area of work, and it holds promise for the next few years. As Borhani was also mentioning in his excellent characterization of context, we do have a challenging context. We all know that the economies and societies were heavily impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic, and everyone is gearing up now for an economic recovery, addressing their own specific needs and their own specific challenges. Although there are some shared challenges that are impacting on every country and every economy. We have the restructuring of international supply chains. We have the reshoring of businesses which used to be delocalized, with impacts on both the host countries and the origin countries. We have digital transformation of many occupations, many sectors, which is changing the way work is organized and developed in workplaces. It's affecting the content of jobs and in occupations. We have actually new occupations and fully new activities appearing also, which are both challenges and opportunities. We have also the challenge of decarbonization, and also a strong trends in terms of demographic changes, not always the same, but in many countries. Just focusing on some examples and linking also a bit to the issue of automation, digitalization. Within many activities, we have forecasted end of routine tasks, and something which is already happening, in fact, and that contributes to what was mentioned in terms of a lowering of lower skilled jobs inside of many sectors. That's critical in industries, for example. Also, we have the fact that you have this change in the skills content of jobs. It comes in bundles. So, for example, digital skills, the change in increase in content of digital skills for jobs comes together with an increase in communication skills, linguistic skills, etc. So we need to think in a bit of a broader fashion in how we do this upskilling and reskilling. We also have, in terms of demographics, for example, continuous population growth in some countries with low labor market capacity to absorb these young people going into the labor market. In some other countries, we have aging populations. We have also pressure over businesses to comply with new environmental rules. And also we have, as I was mentioning, the new sectors such as digital services, sea and water services and activities, healthcare, new healthcare activities, creative activities. So there's a new economy also emerging. Now, lifelong learning can play a key role in addressing this situation, bringing forth this desirable bright future that we are all working towards by skilling and reskilling individuals, so that or supporting them in finding jobs or meeting the needs of the labor market, and also in transitioning for the ones who had to leave or are leaving their old jobs, transitioning into new occupations, and sometimes moving across sectors into a completely different type of activity. There are pathways that allow to do this. It can also prepare youth in general to enter the labor market. It can support sector expansion and support also economic diversification, which is particularly important in a context where a great deal of the economy is dependent on a single sector. A sector is very linked to that sector. It can help also address the issue of youth not in education, in employment, education, or training, so that they can be recovered into the world of work, stimulate national entrepreneurship. Also, there is a basis to increase female participation in the labor market. There are several ways to achieve that, and also generate a national base skills pool, which is particularly important in a country that aims at, let's say, having greater employment of its national population. To achieve these purposes, we need, of course, a strong skills and lifelong learning system. When from the perspective of the ILO, looking at the whole of the system, this essentially implies that certain pillars in the system are fortified, are in good condition. Normal characteristics of strong systems are the existence of an agreed strategy, national skills strategy, efficient and multi-level governance, so across ministries and also in between levels of administration. There is some insight on what are the present and future skills needs, and also an understanding of what are the pathways in between sectors for mobility of workers. There are good funding strategies and incentives for learning, also in the private sector. There's flexibility and diversity of options in terms of learning, good career guidance services, outreach initiatives, recognition of prior learning for workers with experience, and also smart use of digital and hybrid solutions to enable this flexible access to learning. Just zooming in a bit on each one of these aspects. When we're talking about coordination and governance, as I said, there is normally in very solid systems, there is a strategic vision for the development of the policies. The policies also talk to each other, and very frequently there is a responsible body for cross-ministry initiatives across ministries. So one example is from South Korea, where KRIVET, the national institution, plays this role. KRIVET is a research institution that coordinates efforts from a number of stakeholders, including several ministries. There is also a centralized solution in Scotland, where the Qualifications Authority also plays this role. Another way to coordinate policies, for example, is to have a more decentralized way of doing it, such as occurs in Finland, where, for example, regional networks, regional bodies have a lot of input in the way a national policy is organized, and then how it is in fact implemented at local level. Other countries opt for having, for example, a very strong role for social partners, using mechanisms such as sector skills councils, as it occurs in South Africa, or other representation bodies for social partners. Austria is also a good example. But fundamentally, these enable good targeting and sectoral approaches in terms of skills policies. Financing, as was mentioned, is an enormous challenge. Strong systems finance all learning opportunities, so not only education and, let's say, classroom technical and vocational education and training, but also continuing training in enterprises, non-formal learning initiatives inside of organizations. What is important is essentially that each country finds its own formula according to sustain its own vision, and generally good systems tend to adopt cost-sharing principles in which the state and the private sector combine resources to finance training. It is important, once again, to have social partners' participation to understand better what are the actual needs of our organizations when they want to invest in skills. So to have a good design of financial incentives and of funding in the country. Finally, it is also important to have non-financial incentives to the extent that both individuals, if you have individual incentives, such as individual vouchers for investment, are supported in making their choices, and also enterprises need to have technical support also in making their investment choices and skills. Finally, creating career learning and creating learning and career pathways is also very important. We're talking about, let's say, a softer dimension of skills and lifelong learning, but a very important one, because we are putting the users, we're putting the individuals and the organizations at the center of learning, and having command over their learning pathways to a large extent. And so we need to enable flexible ways for individuals to access relevant training. It's important to have recognition of prior learning systems, which means to, for example, invest in individual learning portfolios that are digitally supported, to have individualized processes so that people develop in a way that's relevant for them and for the economy and the organizations. There is a need, of course, to promote technical and vocational education and training, not only let's say the standard educational pathways, but also the vocational component, which means to also improve the attractiveness of these options and make people aware of the great labor market outcomes that they display. Of course, this implies to have good career guidance systems, good labor market information, and also have an approach which starts early in school, in which people are educated or learn about careers early on with the gender sensitive approach, so that they can start, let's say, having a sensitivity to the world of work early. Outreach approaches are also important to the extent that we want policies want to reach inactive individuals in the labor market and want to have targeted measures for them. Finally, in terms of digital transformation, we know that there was a very strong response from many countries. We worked also with our colleagues in UNESCO to understand how this response existed. But there were many issues in access to equipment, to bandwidth. Contents were not always adequate for digital learning. Many institutions, organizations, countries didn't have the correct tools. Methodologies had to be updated. Was a need for the skills of users, the skills of teachers and trainers to be developed. And what we have also understood is that now we must take steps beyond an emergency response. So look at the long term and think about full system development rather than just piecemeal solutions. So we're on that level, we're talking about more than simply development of e-learning, but the full development of the skill system. So the digitalization of labor market information systems, of recognition of prior learning, of certification systems, of career guidance systems. To that extent, we also need to empower users to be able to access all these possibilities, be informed about them, and also create digital learning communities which can support this process. At the end of this process of digitalization, and I heard my colleague was speaking about this new social contract around skills, we are talking about the development of citizenship and the digital citizenship, which of course carries the need of also accessing all types of learning opportunities, knowing how to do the best out of them, and then being able to own one's information concerning the skills developed and how to present that information. So what has been called elsewhere self-sovereign systems. The ILO is, of course, available to cooperate. We developed our activity in a wide range of countries. Just to give you a few examples of what we are doing, for example, lifelong learning system reviews under the Skills for Prosperity project in Malaysia and the Philippines. So there is at the moment, a strong movement in that area in Southeast Asia. We're also cooperating with our colleagues in UNESCO in terms of stabilizing a harmonized methodology on how to carry these reviews and have an exchange of results across these reviews. We also support the development of governance and financing of skill systems. One example is the International Training Center in Turin, which provides a number of courses, capacitates social partners to participate in skills governance. RAF Pro, which is another example. It's a network of training funds from Eastern Africa, and we recently had a major event to have exchange of experiences, identify technical needs. here in Saudi Arabia, there is work between the ILO and the government to develop the labor market information system. There's strong work in terms of digitalization of skills systems, for example, digitalization of TVET in Bangladesh. Also strong work in terms of supporting the development of skills anticipation systems. One example is the implementation of rapid assessment methodologies, which was implemented in a number of countries to respond effectively to needs coming from the COVID crisis. And also, just to finish, the development of career development support systems, such as career guidance, which is now being supported by a strong cooperation between the ILO and the European Training Foundation, in which their countries are supported to understand their needs and develop their systems. So in conclusion, skilling and reskilling can be critical and should be critical for the recovery and for the creation of this better normal, this brighter future. That will require, of course, a balanced and strong investment in a well-developed skills and lifelong learning system. Coordination of efforts is fundamental, and attention not just to one or two, but all these basic pillars of the development of the system. And of course, digital technologies can support this whole process and enable this system transformation. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedro, for this insightful presentation. And we can see that it's a big change that happened to different sectors and organizations during the pandemic. But it is, on the other side, it is fascinating to see how some or certain sectors deal with this pandemic. There is a big change in their environment, in their policies. They raise the demand for new skills and also for new occupations. They look for different solutions, such as you mentioned, Doctor, the learning pathways, which here comes the need for creating specific or certain pathways for certain group of learners to gain a number of skills in a very short time. Thank you so much, Dr. Burhan and Dr. Pedro. Now we will move to the participants. We received a few questions from the audience. The first question is to Dr. Chakron. Doctor, from a policy perspective, what do you recommend both academic and industrial institutions should do to ensure lifelong learning systems are sustainable and meet the labor market requirements?
Thank you. I mean, when we speak about policies, we are speaking about public policies, and usually public policies are about regulation and incentives. Let me start with the incentives. It's very important that there is a support to companies in terms of expression of their needs, in terms of communicating their skills needs, based on labor market analysis, based on forecasts, based on different methodologies that we are developing. And maybe something that is related to the digital economy is that we have today the capacity to leverage new tools like the data analytics, like big data, like open data. And I think this is something that probably will be an important aspect. And the role of the government in this case is to create incentives, first of all, for sharing information and data, making them open and accessible, and developing the right tools to support companies and the academia to engage in it. In terms of regulation, obviously, the skills development is not neutral in terms of processes. You have to ensure the quality, and the quality comes with the relevance, but it's also about the providers' capabilities, about quality assurance of the programs. It's about ensuring that the learners are protected and respected, particularly when it comes to e-learning, their data is protected and their privacy is respected. So some of the regulatory frameworks are about the quality assurance, are about protection of learners. We see some countries doing that, and let me mention a few examples to illustrate my approach. First of all, if we look at what the European Union has adopted in terms of the data protection, the what we call GDPR, and these are tools and regulatory frameworks to protect citizens, but also learners' data and their privacy. It's very important in terms of regulatory framework for the platform and for the platform economy. That's one example on the data. One example on the quality assurance is I referred earlier to Singapore and France. Both countries, when they developed the lifelong learning entitlements, they have created databases and repository for training providers that are accredited and recognized in terms of the quality of their learning programs. That's another example of how you can regulate and what are the policies that can put in place. And I finished with the incentives with the financing, and my colleague Pedro mentioned that. Training is not for free. And there is somewhere somebody or an entity that will have to cover the investment and the financing. In some countries, you have training funds that are supporting upskilling and reskilling. The training funds are funded through a levy on the payroll. This is the case in around 70 countries all over the world. We mapped those initiatives. It's an example, for example, in Brazil, there is a tax on the payroll, and it goes to an organization called Senai that is funding and supporting employers and workers in developing their skills. That's a model of financing, but there are other models where it's companies that are funding, it's individuals that in some case contribute to funding their lifelong learning pathways. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brahim. Now the question to Dr. Pedro. Dr. Pedro, in your opinion, what are the top 2 challenges you see in skill development and employability?
Thank you. Well, picking up a bit on what Brahim was saying, I think successful financing is really one of the biggest challenges. But when we're talking about financing, it's not only of education and, as I was saying, classroom technical training. It's the financing of the full scope of relevant learning that occurs. And we are talking about also the learning that occurs in organizations. So the continuing training, the non-formal learning, all these learning initiatives, which tend to respond very directly to sector and enterprise needs, and that also require support. They need to be typified, they need to be characterized, and need to have a methodology to penetrate in the sectors and finance them, which implies that you have a good incentive design, and also you can have the setup of funds which facilitate, let's say, the management of these funds. Another aspect is also that you can have, let's say, another challenge is the financing of individuals, let's say, plans or aspirations to develop into access a career. This is, of course, a matter for great discussion. The European Union, for example, is going very strongly forward in terms of creating individual learning accounts. But what we see is that there can be different designs which are adjusted in terms of trying to support this individual access, this individual design of learning plans, which relate to the national context, the specific context we are mentioning. Also, I would like still to say, this is still the first challenge, that it's also about the financing of the full scope of activities linked to the skill system. So again, it's the financing of recognition, the prior learning, the validation systems, and also of the career guidance system. Second challenge, I would say, is access to flexible learning. So to access the learning which matters and which is relevant for the economy and for the individuals. And linked to this, and because we're putting the learning in the center, enabling individuals to make informed choices which are meaningful for them and which can make them have career success. I would say these two. So it's the financing and this type of informed access.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pedro. Now the question to Dr. Chakron. Doctor, do you see in lifelong learning systems would be possible accepted across countries and regions in the future?
I think there is no discussion regarding, or at least no challenges of the importance of lifelong learning across countries and across type of economies and societies. But policy is about prioritization. And of course, in economies where the youth bulge is still an important factor of shaping the economies, the labor market, probably an attention toward skilling youth and getting them to access labor market is a very important and probably an important priority. But I think the point is that today youth skilling has to be placed within a lifelong learning perspective. Let me be clear. We were mentioning earlier the rapid change of the labor market, economies that are digitizing, a greening transition, and the acceleration of those changes. So a youth who is qualified today entering the labor market, tomorrow will have to upgrade and to upskill and to reskill. And that's why all countries will have to develop lifelong learning strategies, but probably some of the prioritization might be on youth, for example, employability and access to labor market. But in economies where the demography is more for aging population, let me give an example. A country like Japan has adopted recently a new lifelong learning strategy, and it's speaking about the 100 life cycle. And that means 100-year life cycle. And that means that when you retire today, at least in advanced economies, you will live in average around 30 years more. That means that you have to engage further in learning, not necessarily for work, but for life. So we have to consider the different realities, but obviously the lifelong learning framework will be applicable to all countries, I believe so. Over.
Thank you so much, Doctor. So you think that we should, from now, start to plan to focus on upskilling the youth, those kind of people, the youth people?
No, I think lifelong learning opportunities for all. But what I'm saying is that public policies are about prioritization. We're speaking earlier about financing. If you have today dollars, euros, real, you will have to prioritize. And if you are in an economy and a society where you have a youth population, you will probably emphasize more upskilling and reskilling and skilling youth to access labor market. But my message is that skilling youth is also placing that in lifelong learning perspective. You have to give them the foundation skills to continue learning. You have to give them those skills that we are calling learning to learn, problem solving. You have also to prepare them for a trajectory that is not a lifelong job, that they will have to change jobs. So all these elements are critical in preparing youth for employment, but also in preparing them for lifelong learning journey. Over.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Chakron. Dr. Pedro, how do you see e-learning and lifelong learning can accelerate in filling this gap?
Well, I think that they can contribute very strongly for the flexibilization of the learning pathways that individuals can access. I mean, people need to be able to learn at any point in their lives. That's the idea behind lifelong learning, and independently of that, in a way that is contextually relevant, that makes sense for them. And let's say there is a relevance in creating, first of all, a diversification of the training offer. So first of all, it's creating availability of educational solutions, the solutions for development of core skills for the ones who don't have them, having the technical and vocational education training, solutions for continuing training, technical or core skills training, in enterprises and community environments, wherever it is. And of course, digital and hybrid solutions can be very helpful in enabling. Of course, this also implies that the software needs to be quality assured and needs to lead to certification, recognized certification, that is preferably a reference to qualification systems. Now, I just want to pick up again the point that was being done before, also when Henry was talking about, because if we're going to have this more flexible offer, we're going to have this, let's say, more flexible supply, we also need to have people being able to navigate from an early stage this new reality, this more flexible and richer learning reality. And picking up the point on youth, on investment in youth, I think this is fundamental, but it is also important to talk about the how. How do you do this? And it's a bit what I was saying before. I think investing in career education from basic education is important, because we are not domesticating people to have a single job that they will perform routinely until the end of their lives, but we are talking about empowering people to be adaptable, to be resilient, to be dynamic and informed in the choices that they make. So they need to learn about the current reality and the emerging reality that exists. So for example, so you need to invest in youth, but also bring a bit of this reality into the school environments, into the training environments, have social partners, schools, training institutes cooperating also to develop this mentality, a career learning culture, and to also identify, clarify the pathways, the potential pathways for individual development that can exist. And I think this needs to go hand in hand with the development of this digital landscape.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Farhan and Dr. Pedro. I think we reached to the end of this session. On behalf of the National E-Learning Center and the International Conference on E-Learning for Human Capability Development, we thank our distinguished speakers for this insightful session and our participants for being interactive during this session. Our dear guests and participants, we hope to see you tomorrow in our next session. Thank you so much. And